Melissa Harris had once been a respected nurse, known for her steady hands and compassionate care. She worked in a bustling hospital in Cleveland, Ohio, where she was often praised for her ability to comfort even the most anxious patients. But beneath the surface, Melissa's life was unraveling. Her descent began years earlier when her husband, Jason, was killed in a car accident caused by a drunk driver. The grief was unbearable, and Melissa buried herself in work, refusing to take time to heal. The constant pressure of double shifts, the emotional toll of dealing with sick patients, and the haunting memories of Jason's absence led her to seek an escape. It started innocently enough, an extra aspirin here, a mild sedative there. But soon the mild medications weren't enough to numb the pain. In the hospital, Melissa had access to a vast array of drugs. At first, she convinced herself she was only taking what she needed to get through the day. A dose of hydrocodone for a backache, a bit of diazepam to calm her nerves after a particularly grueling shift. Her logic was simple. If she could keep working and helping patients, wasn't it worth it? But as her tolerance grew, so did her addiction. Melissa became skilled at covering her tracks. She'd pocket unused vials of medication during shifts and adjust inventory logs to hide the discrepancies. She always chose drugs that were harder to trace, careful never to take too much from any single supply. Her colleagues never suspected anything. To them, she was the same dedicated nurse she had always been, just a little more tired and distant. Her world came crashing down one fateful night. Melissa had been up for nearly 20 hours straight, her nerves frayed from exhaustion and withdrawal. During a routine inventory check, a supervising nurse noticed discrepancies in the narcotics count. An audit was conducted, and patterns began to emerge: missing vials, altered logs, and irregular access times. The hospital administration called Melissa into a meeting, presenting her with the evidence. At first, she denied everything, but the weight of the accusations and her own guilt became too much. Eventually, she confessed, breaking down in tears. She tried to explain her grief and the unbearable pressure she had been under, but there was no sympathy to be found. Melissa was immediately terminated and reported to the state nursing board. Her license was suspended, and she was barred from practicing medicine. Without a job, income, or purpose, her addiction spiraled further. She sold most of her belongings to buy pills off the streets, sinking deeper into a life of desperation and isolation. By the time she hit rock bottom, Melissa was barely recognizable, thin, pale, and haunted by the ghosts of her past. She spent months living in cheap motels, avoiding the few friends and family members who tried to reach out. But her craving for drugs remained relentless, and when her money ran out, she realized she needed a new plan to survive. Melissa Harris, desperate and at the end of her rope, realized she couldn't survive much longer in the state she was in. Her addiction had consumed her, but she knew she needed to find a way out, or at least the appearance of trying. She decided to attend a Narcotics Anonymous meeting, hoping to find some direction or even just someone who might understand her struggles. The room was filled with people from all walks of life, each battling their own demons. Melissa sat quietly, listening to others share their stories. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated before finally standing up. "Hi, my name is Melissa," she began, her voice shaky. "I was a nurse. I loved my job, but I made mistakes. Big mistakes. And now I'm just trying to find a way to start over." The group nodded in understanding, offering polite applause as she sat down. Among them was a man named Tony, a regular attendee who had been clean for 2 years. He was in his mid-40s with kind eyes and an air of someone who wanted to believe the best in people. After the meeting, he approached her. "You've got a good heart, Melissa," Tony said, offering her a cup of coffee. "It takes guts to admit what you've been through. Listen, a buddy of mine has a relative who's been looking for a nurse. Private care. He's not in great health, but he's well off and connected, works in a bank. It might not be easy, but it's honest work, and you could use the stability." Melissa's eyes widened. "Really? You'd recommend me?" she asked, masking her surprise. She had expected pity, not an opportunity. Tony nodded. You seem like someone who just needs a break. I'll vouch for you. He trusts me, so if you're interested, I can make a call. Melissa hesitated for a moment, then smiled. Thank you, I really appreciate this, she said, putting just the right amount of sincerity into her voice. Inside, however, her mind was already working. If this man was connected to a bank, it might just be the opportunity she needed. Not for a fresh start, but for something much riskier. Over the next week, Tony made good on his promise, arranging for Melissa to meet with Henry Walsh, the director of a major bank who needed a private nurse. Henry's health had been deteriorating, and his family insisted he have someone to assist him daily. Thanks to Tony's glowing recommendation, Melissa was hired without much scrutiny. As she started her new role, Melissa was the picture of professionalism. She arrived on time, meticulously managed Henry's medications, and even went out of her way to make his life more comfortable. Henry quickly came to trust her, often confiding in her about his struggles with work and health. Melissa was determined to excel in her new role. After everything she had been through, this job felt like a lifeline, a chance to prove she could still contribute something meaningful. She arrived early every morning, dressed neatly, and often stayed late, ensuring Henry was comfortable. She prepared his meals to match his dietary needs, adjusted his medications to ease his chronic pain, and even took the time to make small gestures, like organizing his office to make his days less stressful. Her devotion seemed genuine, and to an extent, it was. She needed him to trust her completely. Henry quickly grew to depend on Melissa, not just for her medical expertise, but for her calm presence. He would share details about his struggles, his health, his family, and occasionally, his work. He didn't see Melissa as an outsider, but as someone who had seamlessly integrated into his life. And Melissa, for her part, listened attentively, always careful not to press too hard, while quietly absorbing every detail. Her first inkling of opportunity came when Henry asked her to retrieve a document from his safe. He trusted her enough to open the safe in her presence, punching in the code without hesitation. She kept her gaze neutral, but in her peripheral vision she noted the sequence of his fingers. She told herself it was just a nurse's instinct to observe details. It was her job to notice things after all. As the weeks passed, Henry became more comfortable with her presence, occasionally asking her to assist with small tasks that required access to sensitive areas. Melissa, can you grab that ledger from my desk? Or, could you pass me my key fob? He'd say, as casually as if she were an assistant. Melissa always complied with steady hands and a kind smile, but each time, she filed away what she learned: the layout of the office, the placement of his fob, and the timing of his movements. One evening, as Henry nodded off in his chair after a long day, Melissa quietly tidied his desk. Beneath a stack of papers, she found a schedule outlining cash deliveries and transfers. It was just a glance. She didn't dare linger. But the information lingered in her mind. The thought flickered. If someone wanted to, they could. At first, the idea seemed absurd. She pushed it away, convincing herself it was just a fleeting thought born of desperation. But the more she observed, the more the pieces started to fit together. The bank's systems relied heavily on Henry's access, his fob, his codes, his authority. And Henry, trusting and overworked, was careless with all three. Her transition from nurse to planner was subtle, almost imperceptible even to herself. At first, she justified her curiosity as simply being thorough. She told herself that understanding how things worked in Henry's world helped her anticipate his needs. But soon, she began noticing more. The timing of the guards' rotations, the rhythms of the office, the days when the vault was busiest. One night, while preparing Henry's evening dose of medication, she realized just how much power she had. Henry trusted her implicitly, relied on her completely. She held the keys, not just to his health, but to his access, his influence, his world. The thought solidified in her mind. This wasn't just a lifeline. This was an opportunity. Melissa sat quietly in the corner of Henry's office, her hands folded neatly in her lap as he dozed off in his chair. The faint hum of the air conditioner filled the room, the only sound accompanying the glow of a desk lamp. She glanced at the cluttered surface of his desk, where schedules, reports, and his ever-present security fob lay within arm's reach. For weeks, she had been piecing together the puzzle in her mind. Every time Henry casually mentioned a detail about the bank, delivery schedules, staff rotations, or the intricacies of the vault, she tucked it away, not because she intended to act on it, but because she couldn't stop herself from noticing. At least that's what she told herself at first. But now, sitting there in the silence, she realized she wasn't just observing. She was planning. The thought had been a whisper at the start, a quiet what if that flickered in and out of her mind. But now it was loud, insistent, impossible to ignore. She had the information. She had his trust. And she had the perfect cover. Henry had unwittingly handed her the tools, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this was her chance to escape the suffocating cycle of her life. That evening, as Henry stirred awake, Melissa spoke gently. "I think you should take your evening medication now," she said, handing him a glass of water and his pills. He nodded groggily, swallowing them without question. As he leaned back and closed his eyes again, she allowed herself a rare moment to let her thoughts run wild. She imagined the vault, the stacks of cash she'd seen in her fleeting glance at his safe. The idea of having all that money that could erase her debts, secure her future, and, most importantly, give her freedom, was intoxicating. The next morning, Melissa began to act on her plans subtly but deliberately. She made herself indispensable not just as a nurse but as someone Henry relied on for small but crucial tasks. "Could you check if the ledger from yesterday is filed correctly?" he'd ask. "Or can you remind me where I put that security briefing?" Every task gave her another piece of the puzzle. One day, Henry casually mentioned an upcoming cash delivery, a significant transfer to the bank's central vault. "It's routine," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "But it always makes the staff anxious. You'd think we were handling gold bars." Melissa smiled politely, but inside, the final piece clicked into place. This was the moment she had been waiting for. That evening, as she prepared Henry's medication, she added a mild sedative, ensuring he'd be groggy but functional. She didn't need him incapacitated, just distracted enough not to notice the small things she was about to do. After Henry fell asleep, she retrieved his fob and copied the access code she had memorized from previous observations. Her hands were steady, her movements practiced. She replaced the fob exactly as she'd found it, leaving no trace of her actions. The plan was becoming clearer by the day. Melissa wasn't just using the information Henry had unwittingly given her. She was constructing a flawless strategy. She wouldn't act alone, she needed others to execute the riskier parts. But she was the mastermind, and the knowledge she had gained from Henry was her key to success. Melissa's plan unfolded with meticulous precision. She knew that her next step required allies, people desperate enough to take the risks but who wouldn't ask too many questions. Over the course of a few weeks, she discreetly reached out to individuals she knew through connections at Narcotics Anonymous. She was careful, approaching only those she sensed were on the edge, much like she had been. Her first recruit was Paul, a former security guard who had lost his job after being caught stealing supplies from his employer. Paul was bitter, broke, and eager for a chance to prove his worth. "I know how to get in and out of places like that," he said when Melissa outlined the plan, his voice tinged with both desperation and bravado. "I'm in." Next was Rachel, a tech-savvy young woman who had once been a promising IT professional before her gambling addiction cost her everything. Melissa presented the job as a way to start fresh with a big payday. Rachel hesitated at first but ultimately agreed, her need for money outweighing her doubts. Finally, Melissa approached Eric, an ex-convict with a knack for logistics and a strong aversion to violence. "This is clean," she assured him. "No one gets hurt, we're just taking what no one will miss." With the team assembled, Melissa spent days drilling them on the plan. Each member had a specific role to play, and Melissa ensured they understood the timing and coordination required. They studied the bank's layout, security protocols, and guard rotations, all information Melissa had gathered from her time with Henry. She left nothing to chance. The chosen day was the same day Henry had mentioned, the large cash delivery to the central vault. Melissa arrived at the office early, as usual, and went through her routine with Henry. She made him tea, ensuring it contained just enough sedative to make him sluggish, but not alarmingly so. As he leaned back in his chair, half asleep, Melissa calmly retrieved his fob and handed it off to Paul, who waited outside under the guise of a courier. Henry barely noticed as she returned to her desk, his trust in her unshaken. Rachel, stationed in a van nearby, used the access codes Melissa had memorized to disable the alarm system temporarily. It was risky. There was a small window before the backup systems would kick in, but Rachel's skills proved up to the task. Paul entered the building through a side door Melissa had left unlocked earlier. He moved swiftly and with purpose, using Henry's fob to gain access to the vault. Inside, the stacks of cash were just as Melissa had imagined. Paul worked quickly, filling duffel bags and passing them to Eric, who loaded them into a getaway car parked in an alley nearby. Meanwhile, Melissa stayed in the office, keeping an eye on Henry and maintaining her calm demeanor. She pretended to be sorting through paperwork, all the while tracking the team's progress through the faint buzz of a hidden earpiece. As the final bag was loaded, Rachel reactivated the alarm system, making it appear as though everything was functioning normally. Paul slipped out unnoticed, and Eric drove the car away with the money. The entire operation took less than 20 minutes. Back in the office, Henry stirred, muttering something about needing fresh air. Melissa smiled and helped him to his feet, guiding him to the window. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing had happened. Henry had no idea that the bank vault below had just been emptied. The team regrouped at the safe house, a small dilapidated cabin on the outskirts of town. The air was electric with adrenaline as they piled into the room, their breaths visible in the cold night air. Paul was the last to arrive, hauling the final duffel bag over his shoulder and slamming the door behind him. "We did it," he said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and triumph. He dropped the bag on the table, its weight thudding against the wood. The others nodded silently, still processing what they had just pulled off. For a moment, no one spoke, as if saying anything might shatter the surreal victory they had achieved. Melissa, seated at the head of the table, broke the silence. "Let's see what we've got," she said, her tone calm but laced with anticipation. One by one, they opened the bags, revealing stacks of crisp bills neatly bound in paper bands. The room filled with the faint scent of money, a smell none of them had ever encountered in such abundance. Eric let out a low whistle. "That's a hell of a lot of cash," he said, his eyes wide as he picked up a bundle. "I've never seen anything like this." Rachel, usually reserved, couldn't hide her grin. "This is life-changing," she murmured, running her fingers over the bills. "We actually did it." Melissa remained composed, but inside her mind was racing. She knew the hardest part was still ahead, staying under the radar, laundering the money and ensuring that no one traced it back to them. She watched as the others celebrated quietly, each lost in their own thoughts about what the money meant for their futures. After counting the cash 3 times to be sure, they tallied just over $2.3 million. It was more than Melissa had anticipated, and the sight of it spread across the table was intoxicating. For the first time in years, she felt like she was in control, like she had taken back the power life had stolen from her. But the euphoria didn't last long. Melissa leaned forward, her face serious. "All right," she said, snapping the group out of their daze. "This isn't over yet. The money needs to be hidden. We can't spend a single dollar until we're sure it's clean. Paul, Eric, you're responsible for splitting it up. Take it to the locations we discussed. Rachel, I need you to start looking into laundering options. Small purchases, safe accounts, nothing flashy." The group nodded, their excitement tempered by the realization of what lay ahead. Paul stood, slinging a duffel over his shoulder. "I'll take the first batch tonight," he said. "The less time it spends in one place, the better." Eric grabbed another bag, glancing at Melissa. "What about you?" "I'm going home," Melissa replied. "Tomorrow's a normal day, remember? We have to act like nothing happened. I'll be with Henry, keeping everything routine." As they dispersed, Melissa felt a momentary pang of unease. This wasn't just about trust. It was about keeping control. She had orchestrated everything, but now the money was out of her hands, and that unsettled her. Still, she kept her composure, leaving the safe house under the cover of darkness and slipping back into her apartment unnoticed. That night, as Melissa lay in bed, she couldn't shake the image of the cash spread across the table. She had done what she needed to do, what she believed she deserved after years of struggle and pain. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that nothing this perfect could last. Meanwhile, across town, the bank's security team reviewed footage from the robbery. Most of the cameras had been expertly disabled, but one, an ancient, nearly forgotten backup, had captured a grainy figure entering the vault. Though the image was unclear, it was enough to spark suspicion. The bank notified the authorities, and a preliminary investigation was launched. Unaware of the shadow looming over her success, Melissa spent the next morning tending to Henry, her demeanor as calm and professional as ever. But the clock was already ticking, and the perfect crime she thought she had orchestrated was beginning to unravel. While Melissa maintained her cover at the bank, the rest of the team busied themselves with their respective roles, each trying to secure their share of the loot and keep the operation under wraps. The adrenaline of the heist had faded, replaced by a tense focus on staying ahead of any suspicion. Paul, ever the pragmatist, was the first to act. With one of the duffel bags in hand, he drove to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, where he had prepared a hiding spot. He buried the cash in a corner of the warehouse beneath layers of debris and old equipment, marking the spot discreetly. Paul spent the following days keeping a low profile, returning to his part-time job as a security guard, blending back into his routine as if nothing had changed. Rachel, meanwhile, immersed herself in the world of cryptocurrency and anonymous online transactions. Using her tech expertise, she began converting small amounts of the cash into digital currency, slowly but steadily laundering the money. She also researched ways to move larger sums without attracting attention, using fake IDs and offshore accounts. The process was slow, but Rachel's calculated approach reassured her that she could make her share disappear without leaving a trace. Eric, the most cautious of the group, was torn between paranoia and pragmatism. He spent his nights scouting potential locations to stash his portion of the cash, moving it every couple of days to ensure no one could track him. During the day, he worked construction jobs, his rough demeanor helping him blend in. But Eric couldn't shake the nagging fear that something had gone wrong. He kept a burner phone close, ready to contact Melissa at the first sign of trouble. Despite their efforts to stay under the radar, cracks began to form in the group. Paul grew restless, questioning Melissa's control over the operation. "She's still at the bank," he grumbled to Rachel during one of their rare meetings. "What happens if someone figures it out she's too close to all of this?" "She's smart," Rachel replied, though even she had her doubts. "If anyone can keep it together, it's her." Eric, on the other hand, avoided discussing Melissa altogether. He trusted her plan, but worried about their increasing reliance on her leadership. He started keeping a portion of his cash separate from the group's plan, just in case he needed to disappear. As the days turned into weeks, the tension within the team grew. They each had their own lives to maintain, their own fears to manage. But as far as they knew, the heist had gone undetected, and their future seemed secure. What none of them realized was that the authorities were already circling, their suspicions slowly zeroing in on the team and the fragile trust that held them together. Melissa sat in Henry's office, the warm hum of the heater providing a stark contrast to the chill of the tension inside her. It had been a few weeks since the heist, and so far everything seemed to be going smoothly. She maintained her professional demeanor, carefully managing Henry's medications, ensuring his comfort, and keeping up appearances as the reliable nurse he believed her to be. But Melissa couldn't shake the unease that crept into her thoughts. The stolen money was hidden, her team was handling their respective tasks, and no one seemed to suspect a thing. Yet every time Henry mentioned the bank or work, her stomach tightened. He hadn't noticed anything unusual yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time before someone at the bank connected the dots. One morning, as she prepared his breakfast, Henry's phone rang. He answered it with a groggy hello, and Melissa couldn't help but overhear fragments of the conversation. Security audit. Something about the cameras? Yes. I'll review it this afternoon. Her hands froze for a moment, the butter knife hovering over the toast. The cameras? She thought, her heart skipping a beat. As the call ended, Henry sighed and looked at her. Melissa, do you mind organizing my desk today? They're sending over a report about some technical issues with the bank's surveillance system. Apparently one of the old cameras recorded something strange. Melissa forced a smile, her mind racing. Of course, Henry. I'll make sure everything's ready for you. While Henry sipped his tea, Melissa excused herself and began sorting through his papers. She needed to act quickly, but without drawing suspicion. Her mind was spinning with possibilities. Had one of the backup cameras caught something from the night of the heist? If so, what did it reveal? Could it show Paul entering the vault, or worse, her involvement? As Henry's nurse, she had unfettered access to his office, his desk, and even his laptop. That afternoon, while Henry napped in his chair, Melissa logged into his computer using the password she had memorized weeks ago. Her hands trembled as she navigated to the folder labeled Security Audit. Inside, she found a series of reports and footage logs. Her breath caught as she opened one file, a grainy video clip from the vault corridor. It was hard to make out, but there was no mistaking Paul's silhouette entering the restricted area. The timestamp was damning, matching the night of the heist. Panic set in. Melissa closed the file and erased her presence from the system, ensuring Henry wouldn't notice she had accessed it. But the damage was done. The evidence existed, and it was only a matter of time before someone connected the figure in the video to her or her team. She had to act. Over dinner that evening, Henry casually mentioned the audit again. They're sending the footage to the main office for review, he said, not noticing the way Melissa's hand tightened on her fork. It's probably nothing, but they're being thorough. You know how banks are. Melissa nodded, her expression calm, though her mind was racing. That night she made a decision. She needed to take control of the situation before it spiraled further. She couldn't let the team know yet. They'd panic. But she also couldn't let the footage reach the main office. As she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Melissa's thoughts turned dark. If she couldn't erase the evidence remotely, she might need to infiltrate the bank again. This time, it wouldn't be about money. It would be about survival. The stakes were higher now, and Melissa knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going down without a fight. Melissa knew she had to act fast. The grainy footage of Paul entering the vault was a ticking time bomb. If the main office reviewed it, her carefully constructed facade would collapse. But she couldn't panic. She needed to think clearly, to control the narrative before it spiraled out of her grasp. The next morning, Melissa kept her routine with Henry as normal as possible. She served his breakfast, organized his medications, and even joked with him about the upcoming winter weather. But her mind was elsewhere, already calculating her next move. Henry mentioned the security audit again during lunch. The tech team will be here later to pick up the footage, he said between bites of soup. Honestly, it's probably just a glitch. Those old cameras barely work half the time. Melissa forced a chuckle. Technology always has its quirks, she replied, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. She excused herself, claiming she needed to run an errand, and left the office with a clear plan forming in her mind. That evening, under the cover of darkness, Melissa returned to the bank. She had spent years in hospitals, moving through silent halls without disturbing a soul, and those skills served her well now. Wearing a simple black jacket and gloves, she slipped into the building through a service entrance she knew wasn't properly secured. During her weeks of observing Henry, she had noticed this vulnerability and filed it away as a potential escape route. Inside, the bank was eerily quiet. Melissa moved with purpose, avoiding security cameras and keeping to the shadows. She reached the IT room where the audit files were stored. The door was locked, but she had anticipated this. From her pocket, she pulled a small kit she'd borrowed from Rachel, containing tools to pick the lock. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, but the lock clicked open after a few tense moments. The room was small, filled with humming servers and blinking lights. She located the workstation that housed the audit files and inserted a USB drive Rachel had prepared for emergencies. The software on the drive would wipe the video logs and replace them with innocuous footage of empty corridors. It would take only a few minutes, but those minutes felt like hours as Melissa watched the progress bar inch forward. Suddenly, a noise echoed from down the hall, a faint metallic clink. Melissa froze, her breath catching in her throat. Was it a guard? She hadn't accounted for anyone patrolling this late. Her mind raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't leave until the files were erased. The noise came closer. Melissa turned off the workstation's monitor to hide the progress bar and slipped into the shadows of the room. A security guard appeared in the doorway, shining his flashlight into the room. He paused, scanning the space, but Melissa remained perfectly still, her back pressed against the wall behind a server rack. After a tense moment, the guard muttered something under his breath and moved on. Melissa waited until the sound of his footsteps faded before exhaling. The progress bar on the USB drive completed, and she carefully ejected it, ensuring no traces were left behind. The next day, Melissa returned to Henry's office as if nothing had happened. Over coffee, he mentioned the audit again. The tech team said the footage wasn't usable after all, he said with a shrug. Something about a corrupted file. I told them not to bother. Waste of time. Melissa smiled, her mask of professionalism firmly in place. Inside, relief flooded through her. She had bought herself time, but she knew the danger wasn't over. The incident had heightened her paranoia, and she began to question whether the team could hold their nerve if they realized how close they were to being caught. Over the following weeks, Melissa doubled down on her efforts to maintain control. She kept tabs on her team, checking in on their progress with laundering the money, and ensuring none of them grew reckless. But the tension between them was growing, cracks beginning to show under the weight of their shared secret. Melissa knew she couldn't erase every trace of the heist, nor could she fully trust her team to keep things together. As much as she wanted to believe she had control, the walls were closing in, and the clock was ticking. As the weeks passed, Melissa's composure began to fray. The relief of erasing the footage was short-lived, replaced by a gnawing fear that something or someone would eventually expose them. Her team wasn't helping. The once cohesive group was beginning to show signs of fracture, each member dealing with their share of paranoia, in their own way. Paul, ever the brash one, started making risky decisions. He quit his job as a security guard, claiming he didn't need the stress anymore, and began spending small amounts of his share in ways that drew attention. A new car here, expensive nights out there. Melissa confronted him during one of their tense meetings. "Are you out of your mind?" she hissed, her voice low but furious. "You're painting a target on your back." Paul shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "I earned this money same as you. I'm tired of living like a rat. What's the point if I can't enjoy it?" Rachel, meanwhile, was overwhelmed with the pressure of laundering the cash. She spent long hours in front of her laptop, her eyes bloodshot, muttering about needing more time. "I can't keep funneling this much money through fake accounts," she said during another meeting. "It's getting harder to stay invisible." Eric remained the quietest of the group, but Melissa could see the cracks in his calm exterior. He barely spoke during their meetings and avoided eye contact. She suspected he was keeping a portion of the money hidden from the rest of them, planning an escape route if things went south. The tension boiled over one night when Paul accused Rachel of mishandling their funds. "Maybe you're the weak link," he snapped, slamming his fist on the table. "All your tech tricks and nothing to show for it," Rachel shot back, her voice shaking with anger. "At least I'm not flaunting the cash like an idiot. You're going to get us all caught." Melissa stepped in, her tone sharp. "Enough. Both of you." She glared at them, her authority temporarily restoring order. "We stick to the plan. No one spends another dime and no one makes a move without my approval. Got it?" Meanwhile, Melissa's own position was becoming more precarious. Henry's trust in her remained intact, but the bank's leadership was on edge after the heist. Increased security measures were implemented and questions about the incident lingered in the air. Melissa kept her head down, playing the role of the dutiful nurse, but every interaction with Henry's colleagues felt like a potential trap. Her breaking point came during a casual conversation with one of Henry's assistants, a sharp-eyed woman named Linda. "It's strange," Linda said, sipping her coffee. "The footage from that night was corrupted, but the timestamps don't add up. Someone was definitely in the vault after hours." Melissa felt her pulse quicken but kept her expression neutral. "That's unsettling," she replied, feigning concern. "I hope they find out what happened." Linda shrugged. "Maybe they already have. You know how these investigations are, quiet until they're not." Melissa smiled politely, but the words lingered in her mind. What does she know? That night, Melissa gathered the team for an emergency meeting at the safe house. She laid out the situation bluntly. "The bank hasn't let this go," she said, her voice steady but firm. "They're still looking, and it's only a matter of time before they connect the dots." Paul rolled his eyes. "Then what do you suggest? We've done everything we can to cover our tracks." "Not everything," Melissa said, her gaze cold and determined. "We need to split up, disperse the money, lay low until the heat dies down." Rachel frowned. "And what about you? You're still at the bank." "If they figure it out, they won't," Melissa interrupted. "I'll handle Henry and keep the focus away from us. But if any of you get sloppy, this whole thing falls apart." Eric, silent until now, finally spoke. "Maybe we should think about cutting ties. Everyone takes their share and disappears." Melissa's eyes narrowed. "That's not the plan." "It might be the only way to stay safe," Eric replied, his voice calm but firm. "You can't control this forever." For a moment the room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Melissa knew he was right. The cracks in their alliance were too deep, and the longer they stayed together, the greater the risk. "Fine," she said finally. "Take your shares and go. But remember this. If anyone talks, if anyone even breathes a word of this to the wrong person, we all go down. Understood?" The team nodded, their faces tense but resolute. One by one they left the safe house, each carrying their share of the money and the burden of their secrets. Melissa stayed behind, staring at the empty room. For the first time she felt the crushing weight of isolation. She had orchestrated the perfect heist, but now she was alone, with only the growing suspicion around her to keep her company. Linda had been piecing everything together for weeks. Her suspicions about Melissa began the moment she noticed discrepancies in the audit logs and the strange coincidence of Melissa being in Henry's office at key times. The investigation crew she had quietly contacted reviewed her findings and confirmed the anomalies. Melissa's access to Henry's system, the team's connection to each other through her, and even the timestamps of her actions aligning too neatly with the robbery. One evening, after another long discussion with the investigators, Linda decided it was time to confront Henry. She approached him in his office, her tone serious but respectful. "Mr. Walsh, I think there's something you need to know about Melissa," she began, laying out her findings. She showed him the reports, the security logs, and the timeline that painted a damning picture. Henry listened in stunned silence, the weight of the betrayal sinking in. "You're saying Melissa, my nurse, orchestrated the heist?" he asked, his voice shaking. "I'm afraid so," Linda replied. "She used her position to gain access to critical information. The evidence is clear. We need to call the police." Henry hesitated, his face pale. Melissa had been a lifeline for him, a comforting presence in the hardest of times. Despite the evidence, he felt a pang of loyalty, or perhaps disbelief. "Let me talk to her first," he said finally. "If she did this, I need to hear it from her." Linda frowned but nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but be careful. I'll have security nearby." That evening, Henry called Melissa into his office. She entered smiling as always, but her heart sank when she saw the gravity in his expression. "Henry, is everything all right?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly. Henry took a deep breath. "Melissa, I need you to be honest with me, he began. I know about the robbery. The words hit her like a freight train. Her smile faltered and panic began to creep into her chest. What are you talking about? She tried to deflect, her voice shaky. Don't lie to me, Henry said, his tone firm but tinged with sadness. I trusted you, Melissa. I let you into my life, but the evidence, it's undeniable. Linda connected the dots. You're at the center of this. Melissa's breathing quickened, her mind racing. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she blurted, tears forming in her eyes. I needed the money. I didn't have a choice. Henry's eyes filled with a mix of pity and betrayal. Melissa, the authorities are going to want answers. I don't know if I can help you. Hearing this, Melissa's panic turned to desperation. She grabbed the knife from Henry's desk, a small letter opener he used for correspondence, and pointed it at him. No, you're not turning me in, she said, her voice trembling but forceful. You need to fix this. You need to make it go away. Henry froze, his hands raised defensively. Melissa, think about what you're doing. You don't want to make this worse. You don't understand, she cried, her voice breaking. I'll lose everything. You owe me this, Henry, after everything I've done for you. Before Henry could respond, the door to the office creaked open. Linda stood in the doorway, her eyes widening at the scene before her. Behind her was a security guard, his hand already on the holstered gun at his waist. Melissa, drop the knife, Linda commanded, her voice steady, but firm. The guard stepped forward, drawing his weapon and pointing it directly at Melissa. Put it down. Now. Melissa's grip on the knife faltered as the weight of the situation crashed down on her. She glanced at Henry, then at Linda, and finally at the guard, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Realizing she was cornered, she let the knife slip from her fingers, the metallic clatter echoing in the silent office. The guard stepped forward, restraining her as Linda approached Henry, her expression one of mixed relief and vindication. Are you all right? She asked him, and he nodded weakly, still processing what had just happened. Melissa, now handcuffed, looked up at Henry with tears streaming down her face. I just wanted to survive, she whispered. I didn't know what else to do. Henry looked away, unable to meet her gaze. The betrayal was too deep, the consequences too severe. As Melissa was led away by the guard, Linda placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. You did the right thing, she said softly. But as the door closed behind Melissa, Henry couldn't shake the hollow ache in his chest. The woman who had once been his lifeline had turned into his greatest betrayal, and the fallout was just beginning. After Melissa's arrest, the crew quickly unraveled under pressure. Paul, unable to control his reckless spending, was the first to be caught. Found surrounded by piles of cash, he quickly broke under interrogation, implicating the rest of the team. Rachel, consumed by paranoia, tried to erase her tracks but failed. When the police found her, she was disheveled and frantic. Facing overwhelming evidence, she cooperated, providing detailed accounts of the heist and further incriminating Eric. Eric, the most cautious, evaded capture for weeks, moving between motels and using cash only. His luck ran out when a traffic stop revealed his identity. Refusing to cooperate, he was sentenced to the harshest punishment after Melissa. In the end, Melissa received 25 years as the mastermind. Paul and Rachel got reduced sentences of 15 and 12 years for cooperating, and Eric received 20 years for his silence.